They say the lantern guides the lost, but here...
The last receipt I signed before the world ended was for $48,000 worth of freeze-dried beef stroganoff. I remember the pen. A Mont Blanc my second wife gave me the Christmas before she left. The one I kept, not because of sentiment, but because it was heavy enough to feel like signing something consequential. The vendor, a man named Dale, who operated a survival food company out of a corrugated steel warehouse in Ogden, watched me sign with the expression people always wore when I bought in bulk, half impressed, half certain I was insane. I thanked him. He loaded 16 pallets into a refrigerated truck I'd hired to drive them to a property I owned, but had never slept in. Then I flew home to Scottsdale and ate pad thai from a plastic container while sitting on a kitchen island that cost more than Dale's truck. That was 11 months before the first confirmed bite. If you want to hear what a $1.6 million survival plan actually looked like when the world ended, subscribe now and tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight. My name is Garrett Linden. I was 53 when the outbreak began. The owner of 4 laundromats, 2 car washes, and a regional janitorial supply company I inherited from my father, and grew into something that generated enough passive income to make me a particular kind of dangerous. Not rich enough to be eccentric, rich enough to be indulged. And I had spent $1.6 million over 7 years building a survival compound I described to my accountant as a hunting lodge, to my insurance agent as a rural storage facility, and to myself as the single rational act in an irrational life. The property sat on 80 acres of private land in the Gila National Forest, southern New Mexico. Elevation 6,800 feet. 1 road in, gated, monitored by 4 solar-powered cameras that fed to an app on my phone. The main structure was a reinforced concrete residence built into the south-facing slope of a ridge, 3,000 square feet, earth-sheltered on 3 sides, with a standing seam metal roof and 6 inches of spray foam insulation beneath the concrete shell. I had a 6,000-gallon rainwater collection system, a 12-kilowatt solar array with a battery bank that could run the building for 9 days without sunlight, a 500-gallon propane tank for backup generation, a septic system rated for 20 people, and a root cellar carved into the bedrock that maintained 55 degrees year-round. I had medical supplies purchased through a veterinary wholesale account. I had weapons I won't inventory but will say were sufficient. I had the freeze-dried stroganoff and 200 other varieties of preserved food stacked floor to ceiling in a dedicated pantry that I'd climate-controlled to 62 degrees and 30% humidity. I had all of this, and I had not told my daughter Becca about any of it. That fact is where the story actually begins, not in the compound. Not in the spreadsheets, where I tracked every purchase with a column for unit cost and another for estimated caloric yield per dollar. It begins in the silence between me and the one person the compound was theoretically built to protect. Becca was 26, living in Albuquerque, working as a physical therapist at a rehabilitation center near the university. We spoke every 2 weeks with the forced cheerfulness of people who had agreed, without ever discussing it, that the divorce and the years I spent prioritizing infrastructure over presence were subjects that existed behind glass. She knew I had property down south. She did not know what was on it. She did not know that every time I visited her for lunch in Albuquerque, I drove an extra 3 hours afterward to check pressure gauges and rotate stock. Why didn't I tell her? The honest answer is not that I feared her judgment, though I did. It's that telling her would have required me to explain why, and explaining why would have meant saying aloud that I had spent 7 years building a concrete proof of the conviction that everything she was constructing, her apartment, her careful, slow-built life, was temporary, that I believed the world she trusted was a skin stretched over something that would tear. I could not say that to her and remain the version of her father she was willing to have lunch with. So I kept the compound like I kept the Mont Blanc, heavy in my hand, useful for signing things no one else would read. The outbreak didn't start the way I'd modeled. None of them do, I suppose, but I'd been particularly specific in my modeling. I had 3 ring binders in the compound's office labeled scenarios, each containing printed contingency plans for pandemics, grid failure, economic collapse, and regional nuclear exchange. I had timelines, trigger points, evacuation routes from Scottsdale and from Becca's apartment, fuel caches at 2 points along the I-25 corridor, and a laminated card in my wallet with GPS coordinates I could read to her over the phone if cellular was still functioning when the time came. What I had not modeled was speed. The first cable news reports described an atypical rabies cluster in Juarez, 3 miles across the border from El Paso. 14 cases in a week, all presenting with extreme aggression, all fatal within 48 hours. The CDC sent a team. The Mexican Health Authority sent a team. Both teams filed preliminary reports that used the word unprecedented and were redacted within hours of publication. I was sitting at my desk in the Scottsdale house tracking this on 3 monitors. Reuters, CDC MMWR feed, and a prepper forum I'd lurked on for years. When the first video surfaced, cell phone footage from a parking garage in central Juarez, a woman in hospital scrubs running toward the camera, and behind her, at a distance that closed faster than anything I'd seen a human body move, a man whose gait was wrong in a way my body understood before my mind processed it. The video cut when the phone hit the ground. The sound did not cut soon enough. That was a Tuesday. By Thursday, the confirmed case count in El Paso was 41. By Saturday, the governor of Texas activated the National Guard. By Sunday night, I was in my truck driving south on I-10 toward Las Cruces, then cutting west on state highways into the Gila, because I had watched the arithmetic long enough to know that the curve was not flattening, and the border was not a wall. I did not call Becca before I left. I called her from the compound 18 hours later, after I'd powered up the systems, run the generator test cycle, verified the water filtration, and walked the perimeter fence in the gray early light to confirm no damage from the monsoon season I'd missed. I called her from a position of operational readiness because I believed that was what a father owed a daughter. Not panic, not a trembling voice on a highway. Competence, delivered from the place competence had built. She answered on the 4th ring. I heard television news audio in the background. She already knew. "Dad, are you watching this? I'm at the property. In the Gila. I need you to get in your car right now and drive to me. I'm going to give you coordinates." Silence. Not the silence of confusion. The silence of a person recalculating who they are speaking to. "What property? You mean the hunting place?" "It's not a hunting lodge, Becca. It's a compound. I built it for this. I've been building it for 7 years, and I need you to get in your car, take I-25 south to Truth or Consequences, then go west on 152 into the forest. I'll send you a pin. You built a compound." Her voice had flattened into the register she used when she was determining whether to be angry or frightened. "A compound. For what's on the news right now?" "Yes. 7 years. Yes." I heard her exhale. I heard the television behind her describe a quarantine perimeter around El Paso that I knew, from the numbers, was already meaningless. "Becca, please." "I'm not coming alone," she said. "Marcus is here, and his mother. She's visiting from Roswell. She doesn't have a car here." Marcus Reyes was Becca's boyfriend. I'd met him twice. He was quiet, careful with his hands the way physical people are. And he'd looked at me during our second meeting, with an expression that suggested Becca had told him enough about me to form a thesis. His mother I had never met. "Bring them, all of you. Leave now." She hung up without confirming, which was its own form of answer. I stood in the operations room of the compound I'd spent $1.6 million building and realized that the first people to enter it would be 2 strangers and a daughter who just learned in 20 seconds that her father had maintained a secret life. They arrived 14 hours later, at 2 in the morning, in Marcus's 10-year-old Subaru Outback, with the check engine light on and the back seat packed with things I would have told them not to bring. Blankets, photo albums, a ceramic slow cooker. Elena Reyes, Marcus's mother, was 61, diabetic, and sitting in the passenger seat with her shoes off and her feet on the dashboard because, as she told me later, her ankles swell when she sits too long, and she refuses to be in pain for the sake of someone else's idea of posture. I met them at the gate with a flashlight, and the particular stiffness of a man performing a welcome he'd rehearsed for years, but always imagined differently. In every rehearsal, Becca arrived grateful, even awed. The compound would speak for itself. The years of preparation would recontextualize the years of absence and prove, in concrete and rebar and stored calories, that I had been working toward her safety the entire time. What actually happened is that Becca got out of the car, looked at the gate, the cameras, the gravel road leading up the ridge, and said nothing. Marcus unfolded from the driver's seat and shook my hand with the wary politeness of I saw a person entering someone else's controlled environment. Elena studied me from the passenger side for a full 10 seconds before putting her shoes on and allowing Marcus to help her out. She was short, wide through the hips, with silver hair pulled back and reading glasses on a beaded chain around her neck that caught my flashlight. "Mr. Linden," she said. Her voice carried the musical cadence of someone who'd grown up speaking Spanish and learned English as a performance. "You have a very serious gait." I showed them in. I gave the tour I'd mentally rehearsed. Water systems, power, food stores, the medical closet, the communications setup with its ham radio and satellite phone. I pointed out the sleeping quarters, the ventilation system, the redundancies built into every critical function. I was thorough. I was precise. I realize now, selling. Becca walked through every room with her arms crossed. When I opened the pantry and showed them the stacked cases of preserved food, categorized by macronutrient profile and expiration date, she stopped in front of a shelf of freeze-dried fruit and read the labels one at a time. Strawberries, blueberries, mango, peach. Each one annotated with a small sticker showing purchase date and projected shelf life. "You labeled the peaches," she said. "Everything's labeled. It's a system." She turned to me. The fluorescent light in the pantry was not kind to either of us. "Dad, you spent 7 years building this. You didn't tell me. And now you want me to walk through here and be impressed? I want you to be alive. Those aren't the same thing." Marcus, behind her, put his hand on her shoulder, not pulling her back, anchoring her. Elena had already wandered away from the group and was opening cabinets in the kitchen with the unself-conscious curiosity of a woman who has decided that her comfort in someone else's space is not a negotiation. I did not have an answer for Becca. I had contingency binders and caloric spreadsheets and a water system that could sustain 10 people for 18 months. And I had no answer for the simple accusation that I had chosen to build a world without telling the person it was for. So I did what I've always done when confronted with an emotional debt I cannot service. I redirected to logistics. "You need to sleep. We'll talk in the morning. Second bedroom is made up. Elena can take the third room. There's a space heater if it's cold. I'll walk the perimeter." Becca didn't argue. She was exhausted, and exhaustion is its own form of truce. They disappeared into the sleeping quarters, and I walked outside into the cold mountain air and stood at the fence line, looking south toward the distant glow of Silver City, 32 miles away, and wondered whether the lights would still be on tomorrow. The lights in Silver City went dark on the 4th day. I saw it from the ridge at dusk, standing where I went each evening to glass the terrain with binoculars and check the solar panel angles. One moment the town was a faint amber smear on the southern horizon. Then a section went dark. Then another, not all at once. Not the clean blackout of a grid failure, but the staggered dimming of a place losing its coherence by neighborhood, like watching a body cool. I didn't tell the others immediately. I told Elena, because by the 4th day, Elena had established herself as the person in the compound I could speak to without translating every sentence through the accumulated debt between me and my daughter. She had spent those 4 days reorganizing my kitchen, adjusting my inventory system to something she called the way a person who actually cooks would do it, and making meals from my preserved supplies that were better than anything I'd imagined those supplies producing. She had also, without being asked, taken over blood sugar management for herself with a quiet competence that made my stockpiled glucose meters and test strips feel like what they were: a non-diabetic's guess at someone else's daily reality. Silver City is going dark, I told her. We were on the concrete patio I'd poured on the south side, where the thermal mass of the building radiated warmth into the evening. She was shelling piñon nuts she'd gathered from trees just beyond the perimeter, dropping them into a ceramic bowl she'd found in a cabinet I'd never used. How dark? Partial. Maybe 60% of the grid. Could be load shedding. Could be infrastructure failure. Could be that there aren't enough people left running things. She cracked a nut and examined the meat inside. My sister lives in Las Cruces. Lived. I called her Tuesday and there was nothing. Not voicemail. Nothing. I didn't offer reassurance. Elena was not a woman who mistook silence for comfort. But she also wasn't one who wanted fabricated hope. If Silver City goes completely, I said, the traffic on 152 could increase. People moving north into the forest, looking for exactly what we have. You mean looking for you? Looking for anyone with resources? She set down the bowl. Mr. Linden, my son is inside with your daughter. They are making a relationship work inside your concrete box while you sit out here counting lights. I'm going to say something to you that I think no one has said in a long time, because you surround yourself with systems and not with people who speak honestly. I waited. You built all of this because you are afraid, not of the end of the world, of being useless when it happens. Every dollar you spent was a dollar that proved you mattered. And now, there are 4 people here, and your system works perfectly, and you are still out here, alone, on a patio counting lights. The question is not whether Silver City goes dark. The question is whether you will ever walk inside and sit down without a reason. I opened my mouth to respond with something about perimeter security or resource management. Sit, Elena said. She pushed the bowl of piñon nuts toward the empty chair beside her. I sat. We shelled nuts in silence as the last lights in Silver City surrendered to whatever was happening in the streets below them. On the 7th morning, Becca found me in the operations room, cross-referencing the ham radio frequencies I'd been scanning with a hand-drawn map of regional repeater towers. She stood in the doorway with coffee made from my vacuum-sealed reserve beans and watched me work for a full minute before speaking. There's a woman on the road. I was at the gate in under 2 minutes, with binoculars and the disquieting awareness that Becca had said woman without alarm, which meant she'd already made a judgment about this person that my presence at the gate was designed to complicate. The woman was walking up the gravel road from the county highway. Walking, not running. She was maybe 30, with a large frame backpack and hiking poles and the measured pace of someone who understood distance as a resource. She wore a wide-brimmed hat, dusty trail runners, and a hydration bladder hose clipped to her sternum strap. Everything about her said through hiker, not refugee. I watched her through the binoculars for 40 seconds. Then I looked behind her, at the road, at the tree line on either side. Nothing. No movement. No followers. She's been walking since before dawn, Becca said from behind me. I saw her on the camera feed when I got up at 5. She came from the south, from Silver City direction. You've been watching the cameras? Someone should at reasonable hours. The woman reached the gate. She stopped, looked directly at the camera mounted on the post, which meant she was observant, and then did something unexpected. She took off her pack, sat down on it, drank from her hydration bladder, and waited. No shouting, no waving, no attempt to climb. She knows the gate is monitored, I said. She knows you're watching, Becca corrected. There's a difference. I went to the intercom mounted inside the gate housing. This is private property. Can I help you? Her voice came back tinny through the speaker. My name is June Okoro. I was a seasonal ranger at the Gila Cliff Dwellings through October. I've been staying at the Scorpion Canyon Trailhead campground since things got bad. The campground is no longer viable. I have my own food for about 6 days and water purification equipment. I'm not asking to move in. I'm asking whether you have information about what's north of here, because south is closed. What do you mean, closed? I watched Silver City from the ridge 2 nights ago, and there are fires in the commercial district, and I could hear gunfire that wasn't organized. And yesterday, walking through the canyon below your property, I saw 3 of them in the creek bed, moving upstream. They weren't fast. They were the slow kind, but they were going somewhere. And the direction was toward higher ground, the slow kind. The distinction landed in my gut with the specificity of someone who had observed enough to categorize. The news reports, before the broadcasts became intermittent and then stopped, had described 2 behavioral profiles: the recently turned, who were fast, aggressive, and burned out within days, and the others, the ones who'd been infected longer, who moved with a damaged, persistent locomotion that covered ground without urgency. 3, I said. In the creek bed directly below this property? About 1.5 miles south of your fence line, moving slowly, but moving. I looked at Becca. She was already looking at me with the expression that meant the decision was mine, in name only. I'll open the gate, I said. June Okoro walked onto my property carrying 6 days of food and the first reliable intelligence we'd had about the world beyond our perimeter. She also carried, though I would not understand this for weeks, the end of every assumption I'd made about what my compound was for. June changed the interior architecture of the compound without moving a single piece of furniture. She did it by being competent in ways my money hadn't purchased. Within 2 days, she had mapped the water sources within a 5-mile radius of the property. Springs, seeps, and creek access points I hadn't surveyed, because my rainwater system made them theoretically redundant. She identified game trails that crossed our eastern fence line and suggested sight lines for passive observation that used terrain features instead of cameras. She found a south-facing clearing below the ridge where the soil depth and sun exposure could support raised beds. And she sketched a planting plan on the back of an envelope using seeds she'd taken from the ranger station's educational garden before she left. She did all of this without asking my permission, which was the part that undid me. I had built the compound as a closed system. Every component was selected, tested, and installed by me or by contractors I supervised. The design philosophy, though I'd never articulated it this way, was autarky. Total self-sufficiency requiring no external input. June's competence was external input. Every improvement she made was an implicit critique of something I'd overlooked. And the compound was the physical manifestation of my conviction that I didn't overlook things. I raised this, poorly, on her 3rd evening after she'd come back from a solo perimeter walk in Iran, and marked 3 locations on my topographic map where the fence was vulnerable to washout. I appreciate the observations, but I'd prefer if changes to the property went through me first. June looked at me with the neutral patience of a person accustomed to managing the egos of men who controlled access to public land. I haven't changed anything. I've identified vulnerabilities. You can choose to address them or not. The fence has held for 3 years. The fence has held during 3 years without a reason to test it. The creek bed siting changes the threat model. What was adequate for privacy isn't adequate for defense. She was right. And being right in my compound was my function. I felt something tighten in my chest that I recognized, from my marriage and from my years of parenting, as the precursor to saying something I'd regret. Elena, who was chopping garlic at the counter with the steady rhythm of a woman who has heard 1,000 arguments begin, spoke without looking up. Garrett, she is telling you where the walls are weak. In my experience, the person who tells you where the wall is weak is not your enemy. Marcus, cross-legged on the floor repairing a frayed strap on his pack, added quietly, My abuelo always said the man who builds the house and the man who lives in the house are never the same person. At some point, you gotta move in. Something rearranged. Not dramatically, Not the way stories describe a transformation, more like the nearly inaudible click of a bone resetting before the pain arrives. I looked at the 4 people in my concrete living room. My daughter, who hadn't forgiven me. Her boyfriend, who watched me with diagnostic attention. His mother, who had commandeered my kitchen and my honesty. And a stranger who was better at reading my land than I was. "Show me the washout points tomorrow," I said to June. "I've got concrete mix in the storage shed. We can reinforce the post bases." She nodded. No triumph. No acknowledgement that I'd conceded. Just the nod of someone who had already moved on to the next problem. That night, for the first time since arriving at the compound, I did not walk the perimeter alone before bed. I sat at the kitchen table while Elena made a tea from dried chamomile she'd found in my medicinal herb stores. And I listened to Becca and Marcus describe a patient she'd been treating before the evacuation, a teenager with a spinal injury who had just regained the ability to wiggle his toes. Becca told the story with her hands, the way she always did when she talked about bodies. And I watched her hands and realized I had not watched my daughter's hands in years. The first real contact with the infected happened on day 12, and it was nothing like I'd prepared for. I had prepared for assault, for a perimeter breach, a mass incursion, the kind of scenario that justified the reinforced walls and the weapons and the field of fire I'd mentally mapped from every window. What happened instead was that Elena, walking slowly along the inside of the eastern fence to stretch her legs and manage her blood sugar after lunch, found a man standing on the other side of the wire. Not attacking, not pressing against the fence, standing. She came inside and told us with the composure of someone describing a stray dog. "There is a man at the east fence. He's not moving much. He looks very sick." All 5 of us went. I brought a rifle. June brought the binoculars. Marcus brought a length of steel rebar, which I noted and filed as evidence that he was practical under pressure. The man was perhaps 50. He wore a flannel shirt torn at the shoulder and jeans stiff with something dark. His posture was wrong. Listing to the right, one arm hanging at an angle that suggested dislocation or worse. His skin had the grayish pallor the news reports had described, visible even at 30 feet. His eyes were open, and he was looking at us, but looking in the way a camera looks, recording, not interpreting. He stood at the fence. We stood inside it. The distance between us was 8 feet, and the entirety of every assumption about human dignity. "He's turned," June said quietly. "Probably 4 to 6 days, based on the motor degradation. The slow type. He may have walked here from the creek bed." "He followed the fence line," Becca said. "Look at his shoes. They were caked with the red clay that bordered the eastern perimeter. He hadn't approached from the road. He'd come up the drainage and tracked along the barrier until something. Our sounds, our smell, whatever homing instinct the infection repurposed, made him stop." "I'll handle it," I said and raised the rifle. "Wait." Marcus stepped forward, not between me and the man, beside me. "Look at his wrist." I looked through the scope. On the man's right wrist, the one attached to the arm that still worked, was a plastic hospital bracelet, the kind they put on you in the emergency room. He had been a patient somewhere. He had been someone's patient, and then he had stopped being a patient and started being something else. And now, he was standing at my fence in a torn flannel shirt, with a hospital bracelet documenting the last moment the system had recognized him as a person. "He can't get through the fence," June said. "The question is whether he stays." He stayed. For 3 days, he stood at various points along the eastern fence line, never in exactly the same spot, drifting with a slow periodicity that June mapped on a notepad and determined was roughly correlated with sun position. He moved into shade when it was hot. He moved into sunlight when it cooled. Whatever the infection had done to his cognition, it hadn't overridden thermoregulation. On the 3rd day of his presence, Becca sat inside the fence, 15 feet from where he stood, and watched him for an hour. I watched her watching him from the patio. I wanted to tell her to come inside. I wanted to tell her it wasn't safe. But June had assessed the fence integrity at that section and confirmed it would hold. And telling Becca what was safe was a privilege I had forfeited by spending 7 years building safety and not telling her about it. When she came inside, she said, "He blinks, not often, but he blinks." On the 4th morning, he was gone. The clay tracks along the fence line showed he'd continued north, past our property, into the national forest, toward nothing I knew of. Toward whatever the slow ones walked toward when there was nothing to hold them. Elena's insulin ran out on day 22. I had stockpiled insulin. I need to be clear about that. I had purchased, through the veterinary wholesale account, a supply of regular insulin and NPH insulin appropriate for general diabetic management. I had stored it in a dedicated pharmaceutical refrigerator powered by the solar array. I had done the research. I had spent the money. What I had not done was ask any living diabetic what their actual regimen looked like. Elena was on a modern analog insulin, a long-acting basal she injected once daily and a rapid-acting she used to cover meals. The regular and NPH insulin I'd stockpiled were older formulations with different absorption curves, different peak times, and different dosing protocols. They worked. They were not equivalent. Using them required Elena to restructure her entire eating schedule, test her blood sugar 6 times a day instead of 3, and navigate a narrower margin between hypoglycemia and hyperglycemia that my supplies made possible, but my planning had made unnecessarily dangerous. She managed the transition without complaint, which made it worse. I found her on day 24 sitting at the kitchen table at 3 in the morning, testing her blood sugar under the battery-powered lamp she'd claimed as her own. The reading was 68. Low. She was eating glucose tablets from my supply, slowly, one at a time, waiting for the number to rise. "You should have told me what you needed," I said from the doorway. "Before you came, I could have stocked the right formulations, Mr. Linden." She did not look up from the glucose meter. "You did not know I existed before the night we arrived. You built this place for a version of catastrophe that had no specific people in it. You stored insulin the way you stored the beef stroganoff, in bulk, for a theoretical human. What? You should have asked Becca many things." She looked up. Her eyes were clear and unsparing and warm in a way I had encountered in no one since my own mother. "But you are asking now. That is what matters tonight. Sit down. Help me count these tablets so I know what we have." I sat. We counted. She had 46 glucose tablets remaining. I did the math on consumption rate and supply duration and felt the particular nausea of discovering that my spreadsheets had a column missing. Not a miscalculation, but an absent variable. The absent variable was a specific human being. Every system I'd built assumed a generic survivor. Elena, with her analog insulin needs and her 68 blood sugar at 3 a.m., was the rebuke to generic. June found us at the table, and without asking what was wrong, sat down and began listing every plant within foraging range that could serve as a low glycemic carbohydrate source. Mesquite pods, prickly pear fruit with the spines singed off, piñon nuts, which Elena was already gathering, acorn flour, if we processed it properly to leach the tannins, not solutions, supplements, extensions of a timeline that my money had started but couldn't finish. "There's a veterinary clinic in Reserve," June said. Reserve was a town of 200 people, 40 miles north. If it hasn't been completely looted, there might be veterinary insulin formulations that are closer to what Elena needs. Vetsulin is porcine origin lente insulin. It's not perfect, but it's closer to a modern basal than what we have. 40 miles, I said. I've hiked further in worse conditions, not with the infected between here and there. The density at this elevation is low. The slow ones follow watercourses and road corridors. A cross-country route staying on ridgelines would minimize exposure. Marcus, who had appeared in the hallway in the way he had of materializing when Elena's health was in question, said, "I'll go with her." "No," Becca said from behind him. She was there too. The compound had become a place where 3 a.m. crises drew everyone to the same room. And I was still learning to read that as cohesion rather than intrusion. Not without a full plan, Becca continued. And not without Dad knowing the route well enough to come find you if you don't come back. She looked at me when she said it. The word Dad was not casual. It was a deliberate reinstatement of a title she'd been withholding, offered not as forgiveness, but as operational necessity. She needed me to be her father in function because the situation required a father's function, and she was practical enough to use what was available. I took it. Not gracefully, but I took it. June and Marcus left at dawn on day 26, carrying packs I'd loaded with 3 days of food, water purification, a two-way radio for my communications kit, and a printed topographic map on which June had traced a ridgeline route that avoided every drainage and road corridor between our property and reserve. I'd offered Marcus a firearm. He'd declined and taken a hatchet instead, saying he trusted his hands more than his aim. And I'd respected the honesty enough to not argue. Their absence changed the compound's internal pressure immediately. With 5 people, the space had felt efficiently populated. With 3, it felt like a held breath. Elena and I fell into a routine that I recognize now as the first genuine domestic partnership of my adult life, which is an absurd thing to say about a 61-year-old diabetic woman I'd met 3 weeks earlier in the context of Apocalypse. But absurdity doesn't make it less true. She cooked. I maintained systems. We converged at the kitchen table for her blood sugar checks, which had become a shared ritual. She'd prick her finger. I'd read the number aloud, and we'd both silently compare it to the shrinking acceptable range. Becca occupied herself by creating something she called a field clinic protocol, a set of medical procedures she could perform with the supplies I'd stockpiled, organized by likelihood and severity. She taped the protocols to the wall of the room she designated as medical: wound irrigation, fracture stabilization, hypoglycemic emergency response, blister management. She included dosing charts for every medication I'd stored, cross-referenced with Elena's specific contraindications. And when I saw those charts, I understood that my daughter had inherited my compulsion for systems, but applied it to the variable I'd always left out: the specific person in front of her. On the evening of day 26, Becca and I sat on the patio where Elena had first told me to sit down. The radio was beside us, set to the frequency June and Marcus would use for check-ins. The first scheduled contact was 6 a.m. the following morning. The air was thin and cold and smelled like juniper and distant smoke. "When did you start?" Becca asked. "Start what?" "All of this. The planning, the buying. 2018, after the fires in Paradise. The campfire. I watched the footage of people driving through flames, and I thought, those people had houses. They had insurance and fire departments and a functioning government, and none of it mattered in the time it took the wind to shift. And I thought, what would matter? And you decided concrete. I decided redundancy. Independent systems. Nothing that relied on someone else showing up. She was quiet for a while. A coyote called from somewhere east of the fence, and another answered from further away. And the two of them had a brief, yipping conversation that sounded more alive than anything on the radio bands. "You know what I decided after the divorce?" Becca said. "When Mom moved to Portland, and you moved to Scottsdale, and I was 17, and choosing between 2 parents who were both building new lives that didn't include the other one." "What?" "I decided that I would never build anything I couldn't share with the person standing next to me. That's why I became a PT. Every single thing I know how to do requires another person in the room. I can't practice on myself. My skill is literally meaningless alone." She turned to me. In the dark, her face was all geometry and shadow, and she looked so much like her mother that the grief arrived without warning. Not for the marriage, but for the years of Becca's face I'd missed while I was building. "Your compound works, Dad. The water is clean, and the walls are strong, and the food is labeled. But you built it like you build everything, as if the other person is a guest in something that's already finished." I did not defend myself. There was no defense in the inventory. No spreadsheet column for the cost of building a place for your daughter and never letting her into the blueprint. I know, I said. It was insufficient and complete. The radio crackled at 6:04 a.m. on day 27. June's voice, compressed by distance and terrain, reported that they'd made 14 miles and camped in a rock overhang above a drainage where they'd observed 2 infected moving south through the canyon below. No contact, no risk. The infected had passed beneath them without looking up, which confirmed June's theory about the slow ones navigating by watercourse rather than by sensory detection at elevation. At 6 p.m., she reported 26 miles covered. They were approaching reserve from the northeast, staying above the valley floor, and could see the town through binoculars. Some structures appeared intact. No visible movement. Infected or human. At 6 a.m. on day 28, Marcus's voice replaced June's. We're in the vet clinic. It was unlocked. Some shelving knocked over, but no major looting. June is checking the pharmaceutical refrigerator. The power's been off, but the building stayed cool. Garrett, there's more here than insulin. Antibiotics, surgical supplies, suture kits. Things Becca would know how to use. How much can you carry? I asked. We brought the big packs, maybe 40 pounds each on top of our gear. Take the medications first. Insulin, antibiotics, anything with a recognizable pharmaceutical name. Then suture kits and wound care. Then whatever's left by weight. Copy. At noon on day 28, June came back on. Her voice had changed. Tighter, faster. The cadence of someone reporting while watching something. Garrett, we're loaded and ready to move. But there's something here. In the town. We've been hearing sounds from the school building across the street. Not infected sounds. Human sounds. Someone's been barricading from the inside. We can see fresh plywood over the ground floor windows. Recent work. And there's a gutter system rigged from the roof into barrels. Someone is alive in there, and they've been surviving on collected rainwater. I closed my eyes. I knew what she was going to say next, because I knew what kind of person June Okoro was. And it was not the kind who walked past a barricaded school with people inside. We want to make contact. Becca was beside me. She'd been listening. She put her hand on the radio as if she could touch Marcus through it. June, I said, you have 40 miles of ridge trail between you and here. You're carrying critical medical supplies. Every hour you spend in reserve is an hour of exposure in a town whose infection status is unknown. I know the math, Garrett. Then you know the answer. I know your answer. I'm asking whether it's the only one. I looked at Becca. She looked at me. And I saw in her face the same calculation I was performing, but with different weights. Not the weight of supplies and distance and infection probability, but the weight of walking past someone's barricade, because the schedule said to keep moving. Make contact, Becca said into the radio before I could speak. Be careful. Check in every hour. If anything feels wrong, leave immediately. Copy, June said. Thank you, Becca. Becca released the radio and looked at me. You can be angry. I'm not angry. I'm scared. She nodded. That's different. That I can work with. June's hourly reports from reserve assembled a picture I could not have predicted from any of my scenario bounders. The school contained 9 people. 3 adults, a woman named Patricia Soto, who had been the school's vice principal, a man named Dale Koenig, a retired electrician who'd lived in reserve his whole life, and a 20-year-old named Ty Beal, who'd been working at the gas station when the town collapsed, and had carried 2 5-gallon fuel cans into the school on the first night. The other 6 were children, ages 7 through 13, students Patricia had gathered when the parents stopped coming. They had been in the school for 18 days. They had rainwater, a janitor's closet of cleaning supplies they'd used to sanitize surfaces, a functioning bathroom whose plumbing still drained even without pumped water, and a cafeteria pantry of government surplus food that was running out. They had not left the building in 11 days because the infected presence in the town had increased from scattered to persistent. particularly around the commercial strip 2 blocks south, where a grocery store's broken freezer section was producing a smell that seemed to concentrate them. "Patricia wants to know if there's anywhere safe," June reported. "They've been surviving, but they can't sustain. The food runs out in a week, and the kids are showing signs of psychological deterioration. The youngest one hasn't spoken in 4 days." I sat in the operations room of my compound. My closed system, my autarky, my $1.6 million proof that I could handle the end of the world alone. And I heard 9 people asking whether somewhere safe existed and knew that the honest answer was yes. I was sitting in it, and it had been designed for 10. Designed for 10. I'd spec'd the septic for 20, the water for 15, the sleeping quarters for 10. Those numbers were in the original plans. I'd chosen them for engineering margin, not for generosity. But margin is capacity, regardless of motive. Garrett. Elena was at the operations room door. She had heard every transmission. 9 people is not 4. 9 people with 6 children is a different thing than what we are now. I know. The food calculations change. The water calculations change. My insulin supply changes. Every system you built for a number becomes a system that must work for a different number. I know, Elena. Good. Then you also know that none of those numbers matter compared to 6 children in a school with no food and a man who built a place for 10. I keyed the radio. "June, can they travel?" "The adults, yes. 2 of the older kids are strong. The younger ones are weak and dehydrated. The 7-year-old weighs maybe 40 pounds. Someone will have to carry her for sections." "Can you get them to the Ridgeline route?" "I can get them out of the tune using the drainage north of the school. It connects to the same ridge system I used coming in. But it's 40 miles, Garrett. With children, that's not a 2-day hike. That's 4, maybe 5 days. And we'd need food and water for 13 people. You have the supplies you came with, plus whatever's left in the cafeteria. Supplement with the purification equipment and natural water sources you mapped on the way up. How much does the vet clinic have in terms of calories? Some canned pet food. Nutritionally, it's fine for humans. Psychologically, it's going to be a hard sell to a group of elementary schoolers. Rebrand it. Call it Expedition Rations. Kids will eat anything if you give it a name." Becca, who had been standing behind me, exhaled something that might have been a laugh. It was the first sound from her that wasn't weighted with the accumulated mass of our history, and I held on to it the way Elena held on to her glucose tablets, one at a time, waiting for the number to rise. They departed reserve at 4:30 a.m. on day 29. June led. Marcus carried the 7-year-old, whose name was Sophia, on his back in a frame he'd improvised from a school chair cushion and paracord. Patricia Soto managed the other children with the practiced spatial awareness of someone at Weirturdan, who had supervised recess for 15 years. Dale Koenig, the retired electrician, brought up the rear with a tool belt that clinked softly as he walked. I tracked their progress through radio check-ins, each one a coordinate I marked on the topographic map pinned to the operations room wall. Becca and Elena and I developed an unspoken rotation. Someone was always at the radio. Someone was always preparing the compound for 13 inhabitants. And someone was always watching the perimeter cameras for movement that our incoming group might be drawing behind them. Becca threw herself into medical preparation with an intensity that restructured the compound's interior. She claimed the entire 3rd bedroom as a triage space, arranged medications by indication on a folding table, and built what she called a pediatric assessment kit from the supplies Marcus had retrieved from the vet clinic. Stethoscope, pen light, a digital thermometer, tongue depressors she carved from wooden shims in my workshop. When I saw her testing the stethoscope's seal by listening to her own breathing, I realized that the compound was becoming what I'd never designed it to be. Not a shelter, a clinic. Elena, meanwhile, recalculated every food supply estimate on the backs of the envelopes she'd been using for piñon nut tallies. Her handwriting was small, precise, and bilingual. Numbers in one column, Spanish annotations in another. She presented her findings at the kitchen table on the evening of day 30. At 13 people, The preserved food lasts 94 days. Instead of the 318 days, it would last for 4. The caloric deficit begins at day 60 unless we supplement aggressively with foraged and grown food. The garden June planned will not produce meaningfully for at least 45 days from planting. We have a 30-day gap between when the stored food becomes insufficient and when the garden becomes productive. The gap, I said. The gap. She tapped the envelope. Your money bought time, Garrett. But time for 13 is not time for 4. And every child under 12 needs more calories per pound of body weight than an adult, not fewer, because they are still building themselves. So we hunt. You hunt. June forages. Marcus builds the garden beds. I manage the kitchen to minimize waste. Becca manages health to minimize illness, because one sick child in a closed space becomes 6 sick children in 3 days. And illness increases caloric need. She had assigned roles without consulting me. She had, in the space of 3 weeks, become the compound's operational manager while I retained the title of owner. And the distinction between those two things was becoming the most important structural feature of the place. Elena. Yes? You're better at this than I am. She picked up her envelope and folded it precisely along the crease. I raised 3 children in a house with 1 income, while my husband worked 2 jobs and came home too tired to make decisions. I have been managing a closed system on insufficient resources for 35 years, Mr. Linden. The difference is that I never had the luxury of spending $1 million on mine. They arrived on the afternoon of day 33, 4 days later than projected, because Sophia had developed a fever on day 31, and June had made the decision to shelter for 24 hours in a rock overhang rather than push a sick child through mountain terrain. I met them at the gate, 13 people where there had been one. June was sunburned and walking with the slight hitch of someone whose feet had blistered and healed and blistered again. Marcus carried Sophia, who was awake and watching everything from the elevation of his shoulders with the enormous dark eyes of a child who has learned that the world is a thing that changes without asking you. Patricia Soto came through the gate and stopped and looked at the compound, the concrete walls, the solar panels, the perimeter cameras, and said, "Dear God, how much did this cost?" with the blunt wonder of a public school employee who had spent her career in buildings the government couldn't be bothered to maintain. "Too much," I said, "and not enough." The children entered my compound in a ragged line. They were dirty and tired and thin, and they looked at everything with the voracious attention of people who have been in one room for too long. The oldest, a 13-year-old named Raphael, counted the cameras out loud as he passed them. A 10-year-old named Lily ran her hand along the concrete wall and said, "It's warm," because the thermal mass had been absorbing afternoon sun. The others just walked, following Patricia with the institutional trust of children who have transferred their faith from parents to the adult who showed up. Becca examined every child that evening. Blood pressure, temperature, hydration assessment, a visual check for wounds or infection signs. She worked with a calm, methodical focus I recognized from watching her mother, who had been a dental hygienist and brought the same unhurried precision to everything she did. Becca found dehydration in 4 of the 6 children, a healing laceration on Dale Koenig's forearm that she cleaned and redressed, and the remnants of Sophia's fever, which had broken but left her weak. After the examinations, after the food Elena had prepared was eaten in a silence so total it felt religious, after the children were settled into sleeping arrangements that used every horizontal surface in the compound, including the operations room floor, I stood in the pantry and looked at the shelves, the labeled cases of freeze-dried stroganoff, the stacked provisions I had bought from Dale in Ogden with my heavy pen, the system I had built to sustain a theoretical person through a theoretical apocalypse. 12 of the 13 people sleeping in my compound tonight were real in ways my planning had never accounted for. They had names and blood sugar levels and blistered feet and a 7-year-old who hadn't let go of Marcus's hand since he picked her up in Awara School in reserve. They were inside the system I'd built, and they were already changing it into something the system had not been designed to be. because systems designed for theoretical people suddenly break when real ones arrive. I picked up one of the cases of stroganoff. The label sticker was in my handwriting. Purchase date, shelf life, caloric content per serving. Precise. Complete. Missing only the number of mouths that would eat it and the names attached to those mouths and the reasons those names would matter. I peeled the sticker off. The adhesive left a clean rectangle on the cardboard. I looked at it for a long time. Then I went to bed in a compound full of strangers and slept more soundly than I had in 7 years. By day 50, the compound was unrecognizable. Not physically. It was the same concrete. The solar panels produced the same kilowatts. The water system filtered the same gallons. What had changed was the pattern of life moving through the infrastructure. And patterns alter a space more fundamentally than any renovation. The children had reorganized the interior with the unself-conscious territorial instinct of people too young to respect someone else's floor plan. The operations room, which I had designed as a command center, became a classroom where Patricia Soto conducted daily lessons using my topographic maps as geography curricula and my scenario binders as creative writing prompts. I found a 9-year-old named Diego writing a story in the margin of my nuclear exchange contingency plan. The story was about a dog that could fly. It was better than anything in the binder. The garden June had planned was in the ground. 16 raised beds built from lumbers Marcus and Dale had milled from dead ponderosa pines felled by the previous year's bark beetle kill. June had been right about the south-facing clearing. The beds received 7 hours of direct sun, and by day 50, the first lettuce seedlings were showing true leaves. Raphael, the 13-year-old who counted cameras, had appointed himself the garden's data keeper, recording germination dates and growth measurements in a notebook with the same compulsive precision I recognized from my own inventory system. When I saw his columns of numbers, I understood that the impulse to quantify the world is not pathology. It becomes pathology only when the numbers replace the thing they measure. Elena's blood sugar management had stabilized on the veterinary insulin June had retrieved. Not perfectly. She still tested 6 times a day, and the dosing required constant attention. But the trajectory was sustainable. She had also, with a matter-of-factness that characterized everything she did, begun teaching the older children to cook. Not survival cooking. Actual cooking. Flavor profiles, spice combinations, the difference between browning and burning. She treated the freeze-dried supplies as ingredients rather than rations, and the meals that came out of my kitchen bore no resemblance to the caloric fuel I'd imagined when I purchased them. Dale Koenig rewired the compound's lighting system to reduce power draw by 40%, then built a small wind turbine from a salvaged car alternator and PVC pipe that added supplemental charging to the battery bank on windy days. He did this in 3 afternoons, with Ty Beale as his assistant, using tools from my workshop that I had purchased and never used, because I am not, despite 7 years of believing otherwise, someone who builds things. I am someone who buys things that were built by others. Dale was someone who built things from whatever was present. And the distinction between us was the distinction between the compound as I'd conceived it and the compound as it was becoming. The perimeter held. June's ridgeline observation had proven accurate. The slow infected tracked watercourses. And our elevation kept us above their primary movement corridors. We saw them occasionally, from the ridge, figures moving through the distant canyon with a damaged persistence that had become over weeks almost a feature of the landscape rather than a threat. Not safe, never safe, but patterned. And patterns can be managed. On day 50, I sat on the patio with June and watched the sunset paint the Gila in the colors that still worked, regardless of what had happened to the species watching them. "You spent $1.6 million, June said. "Yes. And the thing that's actually keeping these people alive is Elena's cooking, Marcus's carpentry, Becca's medical knowledge, Dale's wiring, Patricia's ability to keep 6 children sane, and Ty's willingness to haul water without being asked. And your land sense. and your route finding, and your decision to knock on a school door in reserve instead of walking past. She was quiet. A Stellar's jay landed on the fence post and screamed at us, with the proprietary outrage of an animal that did not recognize apocalypse as a reason to share its territory. What did the money actually buy? June asked. I thought about it honestly, not defensively, not with the investor's instinct to justify the expenditure. Honestly, time, I said. The money bought time. Enough time for the right people to arrive and do the things I couldn't. She nodded. The jay screamed again and flew. That's the most expensive invitation I've ever heard of, she said. I laughed. It surprised me. It surprised her. I don't think I had laughed inside the compound before, and the sound bounced off the concrete walls I'd built and came back changed, the way sounds do in spaces that have finally been lived in long enough to develop their own acoustics. Epilogue. Elena calls it a household, not a compound, not a shelter, not a survival installation. A household. She uses the word deliberately, the way she does everything. And each time she says it, I feel a small, precise correction applied to the story I told myself for 7 years. I spent $1.6 million building a closed system. What I got was an address, a place specific enough for specific people to find when the coordinates mattered. The concrete and the solar panels and the labeled Stroganoff. All of it was just a way of saying, here, loudly enough that the people I didn't know I needed could hear it. Becca runs the clinic. Marcus builds whatever needs building. June walks the land and reads it the way I read spreadsheets. Except what she reads is alive. Patricia teaches. Dale fixes. Ty hauls. Elena manages, feeds, and tells me the truth. The children grow in the garden Raphael measures. I do not walk the perimeter alone anymore. Not because it is safe. Because there are things more important than checking the fence. And I wasted decades learning what every person in this household except me already knew. You cannot prepare for other people. You can only prepare a place, and then let them change it into something you never would have built. The Stroganoff, for the record, is almost gone. Elena made the last case into something with pinion nuts and wild onion that tasted nothing like the label described. It was better.